laid out. But in the early 1950s, when this conflict was really just still emerging, it wasn't so clear. It was mid 1950s before that language that we now hear, that Kashmir had to be a part of India, because as the sole remaining Muslim majority state after the partition, it's what guaranteed the nature of Indian secularism. That language didn't develop until the 1950s. In many ways, it was an explanation, an ideological and nationalist explanation for the claims that India had been making politically already for several years by the time. And the language about how Kashmir had to be a part of Pakistan because of the supposed similarities of the Islamic experience of the Muslim majority parts of Kashmir to the Pakistani state, you know, that Kashmir is the jugular vein of Pakistan. That kind of language didn't develop in Pakistan until after 1971, until the 1970s, when the Pakistani state had tremendous anxiety about what it meant to be an Islamic state with the secession and the creation of Bangladesh. So some of those languages that we now assume that we understand what they mean were actually a part of the process of state building, and very much the nation state identity state building of India and Pakistan. And so they're founded around languages that became a big part of nation state building in South Asia, that have to do with questions about the relationship between ethnicity and language and religious expression and these new nation states, that deny some of the other kinds of historical ways that people express their connections with other groups of people. You know, for many Kashmiris, there is around different parts of Kashmir who happen to be Muslim. Their experience of what it means to be Muslim is not necessarily the same as people who live in other parts of Pakistan. So the claim that we're all the same because we're Muslim or because we have a shared Islamic history has some cultural problems, along with kind of ideas about that the process by which people became Muslim in Kashmir was actually quite different than in some other parts of Pakistan. And those traditions, those Islamic traditions are also different. Also, sometimes, you know, when you talk about this in relationship to Islam, it raises in a hidden way a question which is really important to people who study Islam from a sociological or anthropological perspective, which is that, you know, there are in some ways, you can say, many experiences of being Islam. Some scholars have even gone to as far as to say we need to talk about the many Islams. Now that goes against a kind of a religious studies perspective, or against a language within the tradition, which is always about trying to say there's one, and we have to take any diversions of experience or meaning that move away from that and kind of try to regulate it back within a single interpretation. But again, for many Kashmiris, there are many different ways of being Muslim. And those sites of authority about how one experiences oneself don't necessarily come from some of the places that we now look, like out of orders of some of the Orthodox schools, or out of the madrasa system. And so, you know, my experience of looking at what kind of even, you know, an Islamic political expression across the borders of, or across the line of control of the administrative areas of the former state of Jammu and Kashmir, is that many people, deeply religious and deeply pious, interpret their historical experiences in Muslims in ways that go against some of the hierarchical and otherwise authoritative interpretations, both of kind of madrasa teaching, but also of political parties. And that also challenges some of the ways that we understand what the relationship is between religion, nationality, and post-colonial states in South Asia.
No, absolutely. So that dimension, actually, maybe then I will have to press Professor Robinson before I go to Shamsher on this question, because there is a, you know, as you know, there is a big debate around this with Talal Asad's publication in '86, The Idea of an Anthropology of Islam, which kind of, you know, it gave a nice survey of the different debates, including the many Islam's position. And he kind of made Islam into an actual object of anthropological inquiry and how to look into that. And I kind of am influenced as an anthropologist quite a bit by Assad's work, but also I do realize that there is a very robust and highly contested terrain when we discuss the question of Islam as anthropologists. And I think in your work, one of the things that I was really fascinated by was in the beginning of your book, you kind of in the introduction, you talk about the social production of Islam
of jihad
of
actually was
jihad,
what
of jihad,
specifically,
more
yeah.
specifically of jihad.
Yeah.
And I think that is very important because in that you kind of talk about the two other approaches broadly, I would say. The approach of Islamic studies, which is kind of mainly focused on kind of like the foundational text and kind of normative notion of what it means. And the second would be sort of a more historicist approach, which also has its many limitations. And you say something along the lines that there has to be sustained ethnographic engagement to understand jihad in kind of a robust way. And in my work, which remains unpublished, most of it, I'm trying to
Soon, inshallah.
inshallah, I'm trying to think about an anthropology of disbelief, anthropology of hypocrisy from within the notion of the Islamic tradition. But what does that mean ethnographically, right? We already understand what theologically it means in Islamic studies as a rich kind of textual culture. But what does it mean sociologically? What does it mean anthropologically? And what does it mean in terms of the psychic life of Muslims? For me, those are very important questions. And I think I like in the beginning of your text, you talk about the social production of jihad. This is very, very significant. If you could tell us a little bit more about this social production in relation to the other two approaches, you know, the textual approach, which is the classical Islamic tradition, just to be respected, but then it's also the tradition of sort of a historicist approach, which tends to be reductive as well. So you have a more like an ethnographic approach, and you look for sustained ethnography, which you say is very difficult because a lot of people don't have access. There's all sorts of accidents sometimes that makes us be in those positions to have the access and write and things like that. So if you could please, Professor Robinson, if you could elaborate on that a little bit, that would be super helpful.
Yeah. I'm going to come at it from two sides. One, also, not just my ultimate conclusions, but some of the things that I struggled with when I was thinking about this that led me to think, to make that claim that we really need to be thinking about the social production of jihad, because it carries in it a challenge that can be disturbing to people within the tradition itself. And I'm very conscious of that, and also very respectful of the dialogue that potentially opens up. So, you know, one of the issues when you get with kind of textual traditions, right? And this is very important to keep in mind, again, even as an anthropologist, because these arguments come into the social production of jihadis itself, is that, you know, people within the textual tradition rightly point out that there is a long history of scholarship around the concept of jihad, and that it doesn't stand alone. It's related to ideas about sovereignty. It's related to ideas about not just the establishment of the state, but the protection of peoples, right? And within all of the Orthodox traditions, there are long lines of interpretation about exactly what the limits are, who can declare, under what conditions, right? And they're not all in agreement, but they're very, very legally defined. And those traditions are a big part of why some scholars who are also themselves often religious textual scholars from, say, the Judeo-Christian tradition have made the argument that in some ways the legalities, arguments about the legality and the whole discourse around jihad in the textual tradition of Islam is very similar to those around just war theory in the Western tradition, right? So, you know, people who take the textual foundations of jihad seriously don't do what a lot of contemporary, say, strategic studies or kind of the new terrorist studies people do, is just kind of go back and say, oh, jihad is this. They're actually aware of all of the debates that actually go into creating both possibility and limitation.
Which have a social story behind them. Those conversations themselves. So it's not like a weird like dynamic where there's no connection. The textual tradition has a deep connection with the sociological history, and there's a dynamic interaction which produces those contested interpretations.
Yeah, absolutely. And that brings us right back to the history question, right? Which is another one of the things that vexes the comparative study of Islam. And this is interesting because one of the things that's so interesting as soon as you start talking about the study of Islam and the study of political Islam is there's a kind of mirroring between the comparative challenges of contemporary social science and analysis and also the challenges that face thinkers within the Islamic tradition, where there is an actual global spread. And yet the tradition itself makes claims on universalism, right? And so this is actually something that has to be managed. How do we claim that we're all Muslims in the same way when we're manifestly of a different kind or having different experiences? And many scholars have talked about this question about how the tradition manages these different historical traditions. And, you know, even within the development of very clear orthodox schools, like in context I know best, the South Asian school under the colonial system, the emergence of groups like the Deoband or later the Ahle Hadith, they are responding both to their own historical condition, but also referring back to these long trains of transmission. But they were also dealing with a critique from other Muslims, other parts of the world, part of the Orthodox traditions, who were saying, hey, you guys are fully Muslim. You carry these like syncretic histories of your Hindu past, and your process of conversion has not yet been fully completed. So their response to those critique is actually part of the development of their own Orthodox tradition, right? And so a historically minded perspective on these questions has to also take that serious and understand that many of the debates that were going on are not debates about how jihad develops in relationship to Western imperialism or colonialism, but is actually about debates within different kind of Muslim communities and different sites of authority of interpretation. Right. And that's also very important. But one of the things that I was so interested in when I was first doing my field work with people who were forcibly displaced, and I started out primarily studying refugees. I didn't start out to study militancy per se, although I knew many militants refugees were involved in militant groups. But what I became very interested in was the extent to which the idea of and languages about jihad were so much a part of people's language, their understanding, their expression, their understanding of their moral commitment to political activism, but that they weren't referring to any of these classical ideas or to any of the kind of the newer Orthodox ideas that had emerged out of the South Asian tradition. That wasn't where they were going for authority. They weren't referring to those ideas. They weren't looking to mosques, to fatwas, to religious leaders for authority interpretation. And sometimes they were actually using their own interpretations of jihad to actually critique the official kinds of statements coming out of mosques or coming from sites of traditional authority. And so I needed a way to actually try to understand that. And when I started thinking about that or understanding that, one of the things that just became clear to me so quickly was that approaches that, say, started in a madrasa and then treated that movement towards jihad or the creation of militants or people who saw themselves as mujahideen, people involved in the fight of jihad, they always treated that as an endpoint. But the reality from a social perspective is it isn't. It's only a part of people's long experience in their life. Now, some mujahideen do die in the struggle, and for them, in a sense, you could claim that it's an end. But many of them, at some point, move out of armed struggle. They marry, they have children, they decide that there are other ways that they want to serve their community. And how a society manages that is as much a part of thinking about what this is as these other aspects. And I actually think in the contemporary and the very modern period that we're in now, in many cases, including in Kashmir, actually more socially important than some of those traditional ways of thinking about the production and the management of jihad.
No, that's fascinating. I mean, I've encountered similar questions in my ethnographic work as well. I mean, I was kind of placed in a different kind of ethnography, and in order to be ethnographically sensitive, you would have to listen to what the stories are and what people are saying, the contestations are. So that Yes,
I also
go
spend
ahead.
a lot of time with family members. I mean, seeing me, it won't surprise you. I'm a woman,
Yes.
and I'm read as a woman in the South Asian context, right? This is
Mhm.
something that's actually been very interesting to me. Sometimes when people have read my work where I'm not very explicit about that, it's often assumed that I must be male, because how could a woman work with militant men in the South Asian context, right?
Right.
But I did spend a lot of time with women. And I spent a lot of time with children, including the sisters, the wives, and the daughters and sons of people involved in these different movements. And how they interact in those, how they care for families, and how women and children also manage their male family members' multiple involvements in political domains, whether they be nonviolent forms of engagement, and sometimes even not public forms of engagement, or other public forms, or explicitly violent forms, is a big part of how a society manages a jihad in some sense. And that actually is recognized in the older textual traditions. I mean, people who talk about and write about jihad, and certainly the Islamic scholars, were always very concerned about the relationship between mujahideen and their societies, because that's you can't, for example, abandon your family in order to fight a jihad, because that doesn't serve the community. And so there are different ways in which, even if the site of authority of interpretation shifts from religious authorities to, say, a kind of a more socially mediated space, those questions are a part, whether you're Muslim or Hindu or Christian. I mean, those questions about how a society handles violence, manages violence, and both moves fighters into and out of violence are very much a part of things that all modern societies have to do, whether it's a nation-state army or irregular guerrillas.
Absolutely, absolutely. And that was one of the most insightful things about your work, is this three-dimensionality of the lives of the mujahideen in many ways in Kashmir, that they had such a variance in terms of their experience, and that came through in your text in a beautiful way. And I found that really insightful, as if I was there looking at these. You really did a great job at articulating those things, and I'm learning still from reading texts like yours how to do that ethnographically. It's not easy when you say
it's not easy. It's
the
not.
sustained ethnography, to communicate that to readers. It's very difficult to show the complexity of the life of mujahids and so on. One of the things in my work that I saw, and I don't mean to reduce a more secular life, but in my work, the political actors who had a more secular life were actually able to divide their lives in kind of personal and political in ways. The mujahideen, or the people who were giving dawah, they couldn't in that way interrelated. Their personal, their intimate lives were deeply connected to maintaining notions of fatherhood, notions of taking care of not just wives, but also ex-wives, and looking at all those familial relationships and how to keep those in kind of honorable way from the perspective of an Islamic tradition. So in that sense, it's not easy to do ethnography of Islamic societies in many ways, because it is so interrelated and so deeply. And there are deep spiritual commitments as well, and of course there's a question of the social, as you bring up in your work.
If I can link though also to
Yes.
to non-Muslim contexts. I mean, I learned a lot from. I haven't myself done research in Punjab or around the Khalistan issue, but I learned a lot from scholars and activists who have. And one of the things that was really important for me to learn, in order to pay attention and to not think I already knew where the language of jihad was coming from, was to really recognize that in many ways, many people became more self-consciously pious through their involvement in this jihadist group. They didn't start that way.
Absolutely.
And part of it was because in the Kashmir context and human rights violations, for many people, the involvement and the language about jihad is an articulation of how and when individuals, not led by a state, have to step in to resolve serious situations of serious oppression and serious injustice. And so for many people, their involvement and their idea that this is in fact a jihad that they have some obligation to participate in comes also through a recognition that all of the other forms of redress that they have been told to rely on and expect, from the states to the UN to other kinds of international activists, had failed. And that these forms of oppression and terrible violence continued, right? And for many people, as you pointed out, this is deeply personal. Like much of the language about this would like to talk about the people coming across the border from the Azad Jammu and Kashmir territories as if they're Pakistanis. But many of them are Kashmiris, right? They have that status of Jammu and Kashmir state subjects. And for many of them, they are the descendants of people who were displaced from places currently on the Indian side of the line of control, and they still have families there. So this is deeply personal. And the idea about like everything else has failed. We've appealed to states, we've appealed to the UN, we've tried to document human rights abuses, and guess what? The UN recognizes there are these UN reports, and yet nothing has been done. That is where jihad for many people, or at least the jihad of the sword as opposed to of the mouth of the pen, which is about publicity and knowledge, that's where much of it starts. And then the process of actually figuring out how this jihad fits with other Islamic notions of jihad is almost a secondary or a third move. And so we can't just reduce this even to questions about piety or secularism, because human rights in some ways is a global political concept, which may start at one particular moment and spread around the world, but has a tremendous power and is now wrapped up in many armed resistance movements, Muslim and non-Muslim alike, in part because the promise of how they will be protected from an experiential level has failed for many people, realistically has failed for many people around the world.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I agree with almost everything you said. And my experience as an ethnographer has been quite similar. That how there is in sort of Marxism, there is always a statement that says the personal is political, something like that.
Oh, see, I thought that was feminist, but okay.
Marxist feminist. And I think the here there's an inversion. It's sort of like the political is personal in many ways, and that's been my experience of studying. And I also felt like along with the social production, there's a psychic production as well, which is as we see now in studies by Stefania Pandolfo, for example, there's a lot of effort into looking at the inner lives of Muslims in various kinds of places, and there are these contestations there. So it's very hard not to ignore these in contemporary Muslim life. And so, no, I absolutely agree that, and also often what is called political Islam tends to be the beginning point of research, and we kinship, other sorts of concerns, failures, exhaustions of other mechanisms of politics, and then entering sort of a much more kind of three-dimensional mujahideen life and what that means. And then sometimes going back to a different kind of jihad, which you've shown in your work in terms of humanitarian work as a form of jihad as well. I would like to quickly go to Shamsher and ask you if you could tell me a little bit about the faith-based, how faith played a major role in both of these struggles from your perspective, and if you could tell me a little bit about how you think it tries to repress this notion of kind of private and public, and that's something that I think Professor Robinson and I were discussing. Shamsher, if you want to. If you want to.
That's the key defines our being. Is the center of our authority. It's the center of how our society is organized. if we want to find a definition of ourselves, we have to look to the Guru Granth Sahib. In order to exist in that, we have to be defined. We can't have an identity outside of what it means to be Indian. And that is being, a secular Indian, where our Sikhi, our Dharam, our Deen is, culture, and it's a private practice, and it can't violate the public sphere. It can't have, especially, it can't have a political dimension to it at all. And we're free to practice our religion as a private thing, but at the same time, we're not allowed to be anything other than Indian. So even here, living in the diaspora, being displaced from Punjab, India still classifies my body as that of an NRI. So I'm a non-resident Indian. And India is a complete, obviously, it's a racist term that's born from the European imagination. There's no people, language, or culture, or cuisine that is Indian. The region, Punjab, and what I am is a Sikh. And so as soon as we seek to violate the borders, these imposed borders of the Indian nation state, or its construct, or question what it is, and try to embody our sovereignty that we have, that's given to us by our Guru, this is something that becomes extremism that must be annihilated, and it's justifiable that the state can use all of its apparatus to completely decimate and annihilate this barbaric other that is now emerging, this backward Sikh that is now trying to define itself in a way that challenges what it means to be Indian. We can't be part of a collective within India. Our collective is, India, and India as this secular nation. And what defines us is, as I said, is Guru Granth Sahib, is our Sikh epistemic center. That's our center of, authority. That's our center of organizing. And so anything outside of that, India sees as completely violent and completely extremist, that has to be completely destroyed. What drives our resistance? What for Sikhs? What drives our Sangharsh is our connection to our Sikhi. So we just
Would you one of the things I was thinking about when you were explaining how even as a someone who's in the diaspora, that your body is defined as Indian by the state, as a non-resident Indian, that was kind of very insightful, because it reminded me of this notion of a what is a transcendent mediation, like the largest mediation, right? When you think about a state or a society, that Talasa kind of talks about this in terms of that the state tells us it's the citizen, which is the transcendent mediation. So religion and other identities, whether it's racial, ethnic, etc., is reduced to an identity. It's not the transcendent mediation. So the transcendent mediation is still the citizen, and that defines everybody as a citizen. And each group then becomes an individual identity and unable to contain or unable to be the transcendent mediation. And I think the real political struggle in many ways at the level of paradigm could be understood in this way, that when, for example, if you think about faith-based struggle, I mean, I worked with the Deobandi struggle and the Deobandi movement, and in my ethnographic research. And the real question is, what is the transcendent mediation? And how do we determine that? And if the transcendent mediation is not the modern citizen subject, or it's a violated subject but to be placed in the modern citizen structure, one would have to be reduced to an identity, that is sort of under the transcendent mediation, then there is basically a constant, already an epistemic violence there, which only requires certain kinds of political maneuvers to act upon that already given kind of structural arrangement. And that's how I thought about it when you were explaining this notion of how your body is understood by the state. And I think in that sense, the question is relevant to the state as a form in some ways. And I guess that's a whole nother conversation about, because, you know, when it comes to Kashmir, there are debates about Pakistan and India in relation to Kashmir. And there seems to be a good degree of contestation about it, what Pakistan means to Kashmiris versus what India means to Kashmir, and to actually interact with someone very recently who was traveling there, and after the abrogation of 370. And, you know, the way they explained it, maybe it's simplified, as the notion of Pakistan as a state form could be critiqued as well. However, there's a difference in terms of how Pakistan is understood as a concept for Muslims. Seeding the modern notion of India itself is a very significant thing. Kind of similar argument about Sikhism, that is something that's prior to the modern kind of imagination, sort of a Eurocentric imagination of what the Indian state means.
When we engage with Sikhi, it's from the position of Azadi, like complete sovereignty.
Right.
And when we're engaging with Sikhi through the Indian nation state as this vehicle through which we are forced to kind of engage with our being, our existence, that Sikhs have defined as a state of gulami, or a state of enslavement.
Right.
We can't connect to our understanding of who we are with the Indian nation state.
Right.
Subvert our indigenous institutions and our organizing. In order to exist in India, we have to literally separate out the religious and the political.
That's right.
We have the SGPC, the Shromani Gurdwara Prabandhak Committee, which is meant to be a body that governs Sikh religious places, and then we have the Akali Dal, which is meant to be a Sikh political party. But within India, both of these institutions are completely co-opted by the state. And when India is formed, like Sikhi like defines everything for us, right? So it's so when India is formed, Master Tara Singh, he makes his he was kind of a lead negotiator on behalf of the Sikhs, and it was around the time the constitution was being framed. And he was at the time what the Akali Dal was then versus what it's become now are two completely different things. And at that time, Master Tara Singh, the Sikhs refused to sign the constitution. And what it says is the English, the garb of democracy and secularism, our pant, our liberty, our religion are being crushed. So for us to exist, within any state,
Right.
we have our own view of how society should be organized, and how we have our own view on how we're meant to live, and our own visions of where we're going as people. And all of that authority, all of our sovereignty is shifted to the Indian state. So we can't have a political existence outside of what India is, and that's where the kind of confrontation and the conflict arises, because living within India is a form of gulami, a form of slavery. India has been imposed upon us, and the power that they received, the authority that they've received, has been from colonizers and Europe. When the British in Punjab, they sent a bunch of anthropologists to study. One of these guys, who is a gentleman, he was commissioned by, I think it was a British East India Company Punjab. And he had a chap called Ratan Singh who wrote this really important Sikh historical text that's called Panth Prakash, and which literally means shining light on the Sikh Panth, the Sikh way. And the first question Captain Murray asks Ratan Singh Pangu is, where do Sikhs get their sovereignty from? Where's this claim coming from that Sikhs are sovereign people? How have they arrived at this conclusion?
Right.
And Ratan Singh Pangu says that the Sikhs were bestowed sovereignty by Guru Nanak, the first Sikh, and he can understand it. And I think even till this day, I think India understands it more now, but they can understand where we have this kind of sovereignty from, and that's important to us because it comes from our connection with our Sikhi, it comes from our connection with the Guru, and that was never part of that was never on the negotiating table for Sikhs. That in order to be part of India, we'd have to surrender our sovereignty.
Right. Absolutely.
Major site of conflict for us.
Yes. No, that's a really good explanation, and actually that leads me to a question for Dr. Cabeiri, which is. Sorry, there's a noise coming from somewhere. I don't know, it's me or okay. No, okay, it's gone now. I'm going to jump to the question actually because Shamsher's focus on sovereignty. In your chapter on the Mujahid as family man, Dr. Cabeiri, there is an excerpt that I would like to read, and there is actually something about sovereignty there, and maybe you could just say a few things about it. And of course, where the conversation takes us, I will go back to the earlier questions a little bit later. But this is what it says on page 203. Mujahid as family man. The status of the armed conflict in the Jammu and Kashmir region as a jihad does not depend on a formal declaration by a religious or political authority. It depends instead on people's conclusion that human rights violations by Indian state forces constitute a transgression of the sovereignty of the Muslim community. It also depends on their acceptance of the idea that they, as members of that community, have an obligation to intervene directly to change the political situation. Intervention does not have to be violent. It can take the form of doing the work of documentation and international public advocacy, as in the case of the practice of civic jihad. But in the absence of a significant effort by the international community to end the conflict, many refugees concluded that an armed struggle was not just only just, but also utterly necessary, end quote. So here, it's clear to me that sovereignty is very much a significant driving force. And thinking about all the other means, which we were talking about earlier, being exhausted and having to come to that decision that this is now up to us to make a decision about what to do about protecting the community, to think about this kind of a different future. And, you know, in many ways, that's really, for me, I also kind of read 20th century Islamist thought and many more complex way than how the Orientalists read those kinds of texts. And, you know, one of the driving forces of that kind of text tradition is the notion of sovereignty, the questioning of sovereignty by this kind of modern nation states. And you know, there's this whole debate in sort of Islamist thought about it. But, you know, I like the ethnographic kind of narrative here, where you're bringing how people have to at some point make this decision into transition into armed struggle and what they had to go through in terms of how they processed it, how they kind of rationally thought about it through their kind of theological commitments. If you could expand on that a little bit, that would be great, Dr. Cabeiri.
Yeah. So, you know, because you also talk about the intellectual tradition, right? So, you know, in the 19th century, one of the big debates actually was about, you know, what happened under these new forms of colonial rule. And in a formal sense, there were a number of different new terms and ideas that developed with the concept of secularism, where Muslims say rightship is protected, right? I mean, these were also questions that were being developed under the Ottoman Empire, right, with the concept of the millet, right, and protected minorities. So there was a lot of intellectual debate around this. It's happening in the 19th century. And one of the things, and I was actually thinking this also, while you were talking, one of the things that tends to happen in the world, the language of the nation state, is that emergent political ideas and forms that become important to the nation state kind of get written back into history, but those that were also very important that maybe aren't taken up those by those nations don't become a big part of how the state imagines sovereignty or kind of encourages the thinking of sovereignty, but might be a big part still remaining of how specific communities are talking and thinking about various aspects of sovereignty. And I think, you know, in relation to 35A, I started by talking about that history of the struggle for land rights, employment rights, basically the right to subsistence as a form of limitation and struggle for rights again in the princely state of Jammu and Kashmir against the Maharaja, right? And those kind of core ideas about this kind of connection between the limits on the sovereign's ability to control or exert violence over the body. I just realized that the link I didn't draw that might not be clear is that before these rights were enacted, the primary form of taxation was in a form of labor, where the Maharaja, rather than taking a share of the produce, of agricultural produce or other kinds of money, could actually take labor in the form of a body. And a lot of this labor was very dangerous, and a lot of people died. So paying taxation in the form of labor also meant that the sovereign had the ultimate right to remove people and kill, right? So the ability to create other forms of taxation and articulate rights to employment also meant producing a form of sovereign limitation. And all of the early political movements in Jammu and Kashmir built off of that idea, and all of the kind of remaining political identity of what it means to be Kashmiri that's not based in Islam or other kinds of ethnic articulations continue to draw out of that. So in some ways, it's Kashmiris, not Muslim intellectuals or members of the trained ulama per se, but Kashmiri thinkers were in a very interesting position in the 1980s and the 1990s to forge a regional definition of this kind of limitation linked up to jihad that ties the violation of the body to a conceptual articulation of a territorial definition of the state, which is linked with concepts of Azadi or freedom, as it's linked up with the Kashmir claims to kind of Kashmir autonomy and freedom. So it's not exactly the same history, for example, that Shamsher is talking about, but very much raises that same question of the nation state's ways of articulating sovereignty, its limitations, its origins and legitimacy is not the only form, and there are many other historical forms that are interpretable. You don't have to say it comes out of nowhere. You can understand it and interpret it. And with the global rise of thinking about human rights, where you have a very clear articulation of an ultimate non-abrogable limitation of the state's ability to kind of transgress the body, right, through things like torture and killing, right, with a Kashmiri notion about political identity being inherently tied to territory. In some ways, Kashmiris at all levels as a kind of a social community, we're in a very unique position to really articulate a connection between territory as a territory of the spread of Kashmiri bodies. That is, that Kashmir exists in some ways where Kashmiri bodies, where Kashmiris live. And so with a long history of writing from Islamic traditions about the importance of protecting both communities, but that connection with political identity, some very traditional Islamic concepts like farz, one's duty or obligation to protect one's community, became a part of this discussion. But people didn't link it to, strictly legal forms of interpretation. They linked it with ideas about, I have an obligation to protect my sister because of human rights abuses, and the proof of the transgression comes from human rights documentation, not from a fatwa coming out of a mosque. And then through these discussions, new accommodations had to be worked out because, of course, jihad and fars are very specifically Islamic in terms. And so you would get to these arguments that would happen in the social where somebody would say to a young man, for example, well, you can't go fight a jihad. They might not even argue whether or not the Kashmir conflict was a jihad or not. They would just say you can't do that because you have a sister to support or you have parents to support and there's nobody else. And under certain interpretations of jihad, that supersedes your responsibility to the kind of the political goal is the social ends. But in other cases, they would come back, those same young men might come back and say, but under a context of direct threat, of direct oppression or direct occupation, we have an individual duty, which is no longer about the community supporting and designating people, but individuals simply have to respond. And this is actually a situation which enacts an individual. And so you would go back and forth between these terms, which on the one hand have a long legal and orthodox history within Islam, to concepts that are based to the Kashmiri experience and to intensely Kashmiri long histories of thought and political activism, linking the protection of the body to control over territory, but not state control, right? But to limiting rights over territory, which actually hold the state at bay, not make it the site of the source of protection. And so, you know, this is also where we get to this idea of the social production of jihad is that these movements actually come out of these discussions where people are deeply aware of their own historical conditions, of how they've come to the contemporary moment, and to the political relationships which both create and constrain forms of freedom.
That's right. Well, thank you so much. That's a very detailed answer on the question of sovereignty and the question of different conceptualizations outside of actual political and religious authorities, and how, again, these things are socially produced within a very specific context of Kashmiri struggle. I do want to, if you don't mind, Dr. Cabeiri, ask you one more question before I go to Shamsher and come back to you again. Let me see, I have a bunch of them. But yeah, actually, you know, I want to know a little bit on, you've used Islamic terms, of course, within the context of your ethnographic research, of the relationship or the fluctuations between the muhajir and the mujahid. And so, and you've also kept terms like refugee and so on. And so I wanted to understand a little bit about, first of all, the two levels to this. First, this deep connection between a muhajir and a mujahid, how a mujahid, how a person transitions between these two places, which are not just conceptual places, but also social places and historical and political spaces of positions and perspective and ways of being in certain situations in relation to Kashmir. But the second level is, what does it mean as an ethnographer or as just a thinker to think about these terms instead in relation to the terms like refugee and warrior, for example, right? Because on one hand, it's not simply that a different language is being used and it just means refugee. It actually means something else. So what does that word do in terms of constructing a vision, a world, even as ethnographers, as we're engaging with these fascinating subjects that we encounter as ethnographers and thinking deeply about these terms. So, you know, when you yourself as a researcher kind of transitioned, let's say, or thought about the interactions between a refugee and a muhajir, you know, your subjects looked obviously different to you when you thought of them as a muhajir. It's not the same as a refugee. So this whole baggage of sort of liberal humanitarianism and all of that, it has to be in many ways deconstructed, dismantled, and so on. And when we have this traditional landscape of concepts to help us do that? And what does it mean as an ethnographer for you in doing that? And the second thing, of course, is more socially. If you could tell me about your observations between the transition between a muhajir and a mujahid, what does it mean, ethnographically speaking?
Yeah. So, I think one of the powerful things about ethnography, and probably why I'm an anthropologist, because we do think as scholars and as activists in the world, we think differently. It leads us to different modes of inquiry. But for me, one of the really important things is that you really pay attention not to how you think things will be configured. But so for me, paying attention to this started from an observation of a disjuncture, where I tried then to figure out what that disjuncture meant. And so let me tell you what the disjuncture was, okay? And this goes back fairly early to my ethnographic work.
Right.
So one of them is that when I was first working in the region of Azad, Jammu and Kashmir, that's administered by Pakistan, where there are a lot of both refugee camps as well as refugee resettlement villages, as well as in parts of Pakistan where people from the former state of Jammu and Kashmir lived in various forms of settlements. I found that people were making a distinction between Mahajir and refugee. Like this transformation had to happen in people's language. So it could be like, wo Mahajir hai, wo refugee hai. So what did it mean to have a village of Mahajirs, some of whom had, of course, maybe their grandparents or their parents were the ones who actually moved and were displaced, but in the second or third generation, those children are still Mahajir, right? Versus people living in refugee camps who are not being called Mahajir, who are being called refugee. And, one of the things you get to do as an ethnographer is make mistakes and refer to somebody as a Mahajir and have people go, no, Mahajir nahi hai, refugee hai. Yeah, main refugee hu, Mahajir nahi hu, right? I am a refugee, I'm not, right? So then the question is why? What are those terms? Why are those stakes actually deployed by the people for whom those words have meaning? And the same thing with languages around being a mujahid, right? Why are some people being called a mujahid and other people being said, oh, that's not a real mujahid? Like, though that is an issue for people in Azad Kashmir, like, well, asli mujahideen, that's not a real mujahid. And then the eventual emergence of another term, which I don't think we'll talk too much about, but jihadi. So why are some people who fight mujahid and others jihadi? And these were terms I was actually trying to understand in Urdu, not in English, right? And then in English language texts, a lot of the things that I was reading was talking about, and this is very tied with, humanitarian work in the 1980s into the 1990s, but are talking about refugee camps, particularly in various places in the Muslim world, as sites for the production of militants, to the extent that the humanitarian project became always very concerned with the idea that in any time that you're working in a Muslim context, the women will be refugees and the men will be militants, and you have to figure out how to deal with that because that's a problem for the humanitarian community. And, I found that kind of very interesting, that in some ways that was set up as a cultural issue when you were dealing with Muslim societies, but the same phenomenon could be found in African contexts where people were not Muslim. They could be found in Southeast Asia, in the camps in Cambodia and Laos. And it seemed much more a problem of long-term humanitarian assistance, and particularly humanitarian assistance that was particularly tied with political projects, where in some sense the actual goal was to support women and children so that men could fight, often in proxy wars. And in fact, that was specifically done in Afghan camps. Like in that Muslim context, that was political goal, is women and children, so that you and to go back and fight. That's the language. It's a entire body of scholarship that says mujahideen or Mahajirs always become mujahids, right? Why would that happen? And so I started actually reading a lot of the very specific kind of historical texts that you were talking about, and also religious studies scholars, and what is the connection. And of course, there is a long writing of connection between them, because when you're talking about individual versus social duties, it turns out that in many contexts where there was a kind of an acknowledgement of oppression or violence facing Muslim communities, there was never one option. It wasn't, now you have to fight a jihad. It was, or move and protect your family. And that's hijrat. That's becoming a refugee, but it's not refugee, right? So those kind of move and then reestablish a protected Muslim life. Sit back and wait for aid and repatriation became the political idea under the global humanitarian project, first making a lot of unintended mistakes and later making mistakes that were intended to provoke people to explain, make explicit their internal thinking to me. One of the things, that was just very clear is that for much of the history of the post-independence Kashmir conflict, for the early wars through the 1980s, people who were forcibly displaced and who moved were very much seen and embraced in their communities as political actors. There was nothing that was an honor thing to do, to move and protect your family, or for people who came single to remarry, to have children, to support them, to educate your daughters. These are political acts. They were not seen as apolitical. But into the 1990s, for many reasons, it became harder and harder for those same people to do that.
It was cut off
and it's
from my end. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
It might be my internet. If you could go back like a couple of sentences.
Oh, yeah. So,
Sorry.
in the early periods, in the first wars, 47 to 49, 65, 71, I found people displaced during that period. Men had no trouble, and women, equally claimed the position of Muhajir. And that was a valued political act, but also that accrued moral value, like Islamic moral value, right? But as we moved into the late 1980s, early 1990s, I noticed that it was harder and harder for men especially to claim the position of Muhajir and at the same time claim that position of active political status, moral value. And as that was happening more and more, you also had this kind of like, the way that I engage will be through jihad. And I'm not claiming a one-to-one causal. I'm just charting that there is a kind of a shift that happened. And part of that shift had to do with, as the international norm of refuge and refuge seeking as being something apolitical became one of the ways that Kashmiris could show this is what's happening to people. In order to do that, those people had to be in refugee camps, not politically active. And that valued position of the refugee is a very legitimate position to take up as an active, valued Muslim actor, became harder to stabilize. This is one of conflict. It was a domain of contestation, but it was shifting the space of value from moving to set up a family and raising that family. One of the very important ways.
Thank you so much for such a detailed answer. We have to take a question. I have a question now from one of our Facebook comments, and I think I know this person from the question. But so I'll read this question. It's a question for Dr. Robinson, and I'm going to read this. My question for Dr. Robinson is perhaps selfish, as I'm finishing writing my dissertation on proximate questions in the wake of the Syrian civil war. I'm curious about the various ways suffering is configured across these contexts, in relation to which jihad in its multiple registers is a mode of repair. One of the insights of the anthropology of humanitarianism, as I read it, has been that the discourse of human rights relies on a fairly generic sense of suffering, which flattens the various possibilities for action and also makes it difficult to see why jihad would be the frame of response. Basically, I'm curious about how your interlocutors, mujahids and their families, understand the conditions that elicit jihad, which overlaps with the discourse of human rights but also exceeds it. Would you like for me to repeat anything, or?
Oh.
It's a long
No,
question.
you know what? The first thing I'm going to say is there's no way I'm going to do this question justice. So I'm just going to try. The second thing I want to say is I actually don't know who this person is, but I would love to. So if you want to send me an email and be in contact, I'd love to know who you are, because I'd love to know more about your work. And before I even try to engage, I'm going to say that this is actually a question that I'm moving towards. A colleague of mine here at the University of Washington who works in the Middle East context, although not in Syria. And I really recently got a grant from the Mellon Foundation Sawyer Fund to think about humanitarianisms and their different ways of even recognizing what suffering is and then knowing what care looks like. And we're particularly interested in the Global South and experiences that come out of the Global South as opposed to some idealized Enlightenment tradition. So this is actually something I'm thinking a lot about. I actually don't know whether I have a good answer, but let me try.
But okay, so just to let you know, I have two very good friends who are working on the Syrian question, and one is in UK, the other one in Canada. I think this is the person who's in Canada who's working with Syrian refugees. So I will definitely introduce you to both of them.
I would love to be introduced.
Very generous.
You know,
yes.
So in questions in relation to suffering and human rights, I have to confess, I didn't talk a lot or think a lot about suffering. I was actually very focused around questions about rights and how people deal with rights because of the shift from kind of ideas about sovereign rights and Azadi and kind of Kashmiri political thinking and into questions about those rights that we now recognize or identify as human rights in some way. But in the later parts of my book, I get at it. In some ways, although I don't talk about suffering a lot, but I get at it through actually talking about what some of the practices of transgression, the practices of pain, the way people are hurt and the impact that it has on them.
The politics of
and and a lot of what I was actually looking at or focusing on there or trying to think through is the different ways that people who have bodies suffer that are quite different. So, you know, one of the things that I noted, and this actually came from a comparison actually of some of the readings, again, that I did from the Khalistan context, is that some of the same practices of torture and interrogation that were used in other parts of India, were first tried out in other parts of India and then later imported into Kashmir, had very different social impacts. And of course, that's because people have different kind of social ways that their bodies are integrated into their community. And so it had different kinds of social outcomes or impacts. And in the Kashmir context, the suffering of women has often been held up, and it talks about various forms of sexual violation and the impacts that this has on women. And there's much more writing now about this than there was at the time that I was first that I was first writing this section up and publishing it. But I was thinking about how, you know, by the 1980s, the 1990s, we had this whole literature of thinking about how rape is actually a tool of warfare when you're talking about kind of ethnic cleansing practices and state conflicts over land. And yet in the Kashmir context, not just the Indian state, but Kashmiri communities insisted on seeing this as an apolitical thing that was about the desire for women and the inability of Kashmiri men to protect their women. And I thought, well, that's actually really interesting given how much other language of human rights was so clearly imported. And on the other hand, sexual violation of men, not necessarily primarily through well, also through rape, but not even necessarily primarily through rape, but through other forms of violation of the genitals and the use of various body parts as the means to produce pain, was absolutely subterranean in so much of that human rights documentation and that writing, and yet was very much at the forefront of people's understanding, of many militants' understanding of why being a being a refugee might no longer be an option for them as a way of being a part of the community. So the language of the Indian state practices as being a part of an intended process of genocide through the ending of the possibility of socially acceptable forms of reproduction was very much a part of that language, and yet very difficult to talk about, because for men to talk about that, on the other hand, impacted various other ways of claiming a kind of a masculine relationship to one's community. So it was often women who narrated these stories and circulated them while men denied them. And so the public recognition of the widespread nature of these practices was through the stoic, not denial, but just silence of men, and the constant circulation of this information through women, through sisters, through mothers, through wives, who talked about what they saw happen to the bodies of their men, and in a sense, took up the position of narrating their suffering by describing how much the women suffered when they had to treat the bodies of what they saw had happened to their men. And so that's a kind of a social construction of suffering that a lot of medicalized understandings of violence also have difficulty understanding, because it's not an account that's coming primarily from the person who suffered the violence or on whom violence was perpetrated, but a suffering of knowing what happened, and yet we all have to know. And that is actually also what mobilizes some of these forms of resistance. That's my attempt to respond to your question.
No, that is such a brilliant way to articulate it. I would like to give you a little bit of rest. I have questions. Because I know you've been answering so well. I have questions about that in relation to the dishonoring of men and how the stories are kind of explained in the Kashmiri struggle and the community. But I will come back to that. I want to ask questions, a couple of questions for Shamsher, if you're still available. I think they're relevant. And the question I have for you is about the repression and the silencing of dissent, and the draconian legislation and violence that's used to do that, and by the Indian state. If you could speak on the historical legacies of genocide and their relevance today. And while you do that, I guess the next question would be, I guess to just prep you, would be about, I don't like using the word solidarity too much because it sort of has a leftist baggage. I don't think that's how things are being formed in religious communities in South Asia, at least in my field side. So sometimes we have to translate and we have to use words like solidarity. But if you could talk a little bit more after you talk about the draconian legislation and the violence on the ethical and the political collaboration of these struggles in concrete terms, that would be the second part of the question. The first part would be the suffering and the violence that happens with these communities in relation to the Indian state's repressive apparatus. And the second would be, what are the collaborative ethics, political ethics that's being developed, dynamic between these two formations, the Kashmiri struggle and the Sikh struggle?
In terms of like the legacy of Indian state repression and its genocidal violence, today when we imagine our future, that imagination has been massively impacted. Outside of the nation state, outside of our host countries, it's almost as if we can't imagine what a Sikh governance or Sikh Azadi would look like. And the conversations shifted largely from struggle to questions over representation. And that representation, I feel, is it's symptomatic of where we are now, which is a survival mentality. And that's one of the legacies of having gone through and having survived so much Indian state violence. So the rising Sikhs have always struggled to reassert their sovereignty since the colonial occupation of Punjab, and sovereignty has always been the key thing to regain our autonomy in Punjab, whether it's linguistically or whether it was through outright separation as the struggle evolved after 1984. And the Indian state's response to this had some very key elements to it, and one of them was the militarization of police forces. In like 1975, there were around 25,000 police officers, and then by 1994, that number increases to 70,000. And in that same period, we see an increase the impact of that increase is the national average for police officers per kilometer was around 45 in Punjab. That increases to 100 police officers per square kilometer. And the sinister aspect of that is that the charge for this was levied from the people of Punjab itself for their own security, securitization of Punjab. And then we had enforced disappearances of human rights workers, of students, of journalists, of anybody who was defined as being religious, which completely gave the Indian security forces an open field to literally hunt Sikh guerrillas, their families, anybody that was vocal or critical of the state. And that hunting was enabled by a system of bounties from unmarked funds. We're talking bounties from around 40,000 rupees to 5 lakh rupees a year. And those bounties enabled and incentivized the hunting of the guerrillas. As well as that, they wanted to crush the popular support through illegal detention. And we see this targeting of politically active individuals, of students, and of religious Sikhs. So anybody, particularly young men that looked like myself, that had a turban, that had a beard, there was a kind of sinister importance placed on Sikhs becoming religious and adopting a visibly Sikh identity, and that allowed the Indian security forces to literally target young Sikh men. And there's a circular that the Indian Army puts out, and in that it was called Abrar Fahad, which is like an Indian Army kind of magazine.
Right.
And in that they say that some of our countrymen have been administered an oath in the name of religion, and they must be subdued to achieve the aim of restoring peace. And it goes on to say that these individuals may look harmless from the outside, but they've basically committed murder, arson, and loot. And they identified all Amritari individuals, which were that are initiated into the Sikh way. They have a very visible identity. They wear a kirpan, which is a sword, and that includes our families. That includes our mothers. That includes our brothers. That includes everyone. So everyone who was identifiable as an Amritari became, a target, and that was part of not only targeting Sikh guerrillas and their families, but also collectively punishing, all of the population of Punjab. And we still haven't recovered from that trauma. So when we talk about our Azadi, we talk about our freedom, the language is shifted to the terms of the state. So the state will say, we don't want to return to those dark days. We don't want tensions to arise. So we're almost blamed for the increase in violence that we were subjected to. It was, because we resisted, or, because had any ideas outside of what the state had. And now today what we see is there's an immediate targeting. So anybody, especially from the 80s to the 90s, anybody who's identified, we were individuals that have been in prison for like 30 years plus. So anybody who was identified during the peak of the Sikh insurgency, they were continually targeted for harassment. Their families were continually raided, their houses were raided, they were arrested, they were picked up. And today, what we have is that the threat of that state violence, the threat of the intimidation. And that threat now has become so pervasive that the environment within which to organize is completely stifled. And within public discourse in India, the term Khalistan has become completely poisoned. So there's no space to even talk about or have these conversations within India. And the legacy of the state repression, the legacy of mass human rights violations, of mass raping of Sikh women in Punjab, in order to crush this rising Sikh insurgency, is still there and is felt in our communities till this day, and that there's an assertion, there's a resistance against that. On the grassroots, young Sikhs will wear T-shirts with the Khalistan as a slogan. We literally have to reassert our voices, because the Indian state would try to erase anybody that they could remotely identify as being involved in organizing for Sikh sovereignty. The guerrillas were, the obvious targets. Anybody that was fighting, with weapons was an obvious target. Anybody who's writing, thinking, or speaking for sovereignty became these targets. And in terms of like solidarity, I agree with you, as a problematic term. There was a statement from the Akal Takht that said it's the Taram of the Sikh. It's our it's the way within which we're going to exist, our way towards righteousness, our way to asserting who we are, to stand with the Kashmiris. And it was quite a surprising and a very strong statement, because it called out Hindutva directly. And that's kind of, the last time Hindutva was called out in that strong way was the Khalistan insurgency. And that take this firm stance against exposing and unmasking what the Indian nation state is, has been the Khalistan resistance. So, that solidarity, that invoking that it's our taram to stand and resist any form of domination or any form of oppression, whether it's coming from the state or whether it's coming from anywhere else, it's a very, very clear call. And we've seen that Sikhs have really taken that on board, and they've been very vocal. They've really kind of made it clear that this is not who we are. So there may be like this fear and this apprehension to define yourself as Khalistani or Sikh and not as Indian, but this opportunity for solidarity has given Sikhs a way to define themselves in a very Sikh way. That is, we're not Indians. We don't stand with Hindutva. We don't stand with this rising tide of Indian fascism, and we don't stand with targeting of particularly Kashmiri women, because that's what the statement was. It was in response to comments by Indian politicians that said, now we can marry, we're free to marry Sikh women, right?
It was literally legislating, directly declaring and inviting the rape and sexual violence of Kashmiri women. I want to ask a quick question to Dr. Robinson. How much time do you have? Do you have a few more minutes to answer one more question, or is it time to wrap up for you on your end? I know you have other things today. I can't hear you. You might be...
Yes. Yeah. Okay. I'll do my best, and you may even get a much more brief answer than you normally do. I am unfortunately a little time constrained and have to move off of this at this point. Yeah.
Or, okay.
Sure. Yeah.
So I'll ask a question, which is, again, from the last, I think it's related to what you were explaining earlier, and also relates to what Shamsher is saying about the violence, the sexual targeting of these populations. And there is a part where you talk about, let me see. I have it written down, so I'm going to quickly. So you talk about, and you talked a little bit about the sexual violence of men, and how this is not kind of, men have a stoic way of...
You mean the sexual violence perpetrated
violence
on men? Not of men, but perpetrated on men, yeah.
On them, on the Kashmiri mujahideen. And how that is sort of understood within that context, how then men are able to continue to participate in their struggle for Azadi and so on. And what does it, the gendered kind of dimension of this, and the way it's communicated to others that these kinds of violations have taken place, while at the same time it seems to be a specific way that their honor is protected within the community, and while still maintaining the struggle. If you could talk about this dimension, this ethics, seems like there's an ethic, you use the word an ethic of care, that is very important, significant in this relation, in relation to this kind of sexual targeting by the state, and how the Kashmiris maintain their ethic of care, their ethic of honor, a sense of belonging, and at the same time continuing to struggle as subjects, or able to struggle in regardless of this great harm that has been perpetrated on them. So if you could expand a little bit more,
Yeah.
and that would be my last question for you.
Okay. While you were talking, there were some interrupted, but I think I followed all of it. But I just wanted you to know there are a couple of things that I didn't hear. So sure. I won't be too graphic in this context of exactly all the practices we're talking about. They're widely documented, and if anybody has any questions about exactly what I'm talking about, you could look at the 6th chapter of my book, and also the citations to human rights documentation. But there are various different ways that, in addition to all of the other forms of interrogation that were used of young Kashmiri men while they were in detention and being interrogated, many of which are generally a part of the repertoire of police investigation in India in general, which is often quite violent. Those forms that were specifically targeted at genitalia, the private parts, were a big part of the repertoire. And in fact, in some cases actually seemed specifically to be the point of the interrogation, to produce a particular kind of threat. And in fact, in many of the kind of the testimonies about these experiences, one of the things that's often written about is the idea that these practices happen in isolation. For the Kashmiri men, they were often isolated, but there was often a wide audience of members of the security forces. So in the sense, there was a kind of performance for other members of those forces. And the kind of language that went along with it was, now you won't be able to have children, nobody will have you, right? So there was this kind of a very explicit threat that was given, that the purpose of these kinds of practices weren't what we're often told torture is about, which is the extraction of information, but the creation not just of punishment, but the end of Kashmiris to actually continue to reproduce their own Kashmiri communities. And this idea came with young men out of these prisons, out of these interrogation centers, and became a part of a wider social knowledge of what was happening inside of them. Now, we're now many years further on, and we know, of course, that this is not, in fact, medically the outcome of these kind of practices, but it was a big part of people's understanding of their experiences, and especially in the early 1990s, but going forward. And so for a lot of these young men, the idea that they no longer had the opportunity to become productive members of their community through marriage and supporting children was often a part of joining militant organizations in the first place. And we're talking these early years where exactly the kind of practices that Shamsher is talking about were going on, just kind of picking up young men, students, activists of any kind. And so there is a way in which, in the early years of the production of militancy within the Kashmir Valley itself, militants were actually often produced in prison after they'd been interrogated, not because they were already militants before they were picked up. For people crossing the border from the Pakistan side, it was different. They were often hearing these stories as opposed to experiencing this kind of interrogation before they joined an organization. And so it was more the hearing of the story that might be a part of their understanding of what was actually happening. And it's there, the hearing of the story, where these kind of co-narrations by women became so important, precisely because men would not necessarily tell these stories. Among men, it was known, right? I mean, this is, you could make very short statements, and they were often made to me. I had before I did this research, I had previous experience doing translation for a humanitarian mission in Indian Jammu and Kashmir. And so people would often kind of get around the gendered issues of talking about this by kind of saying, and you know what happens in interrogation. And I would kind of say yes. And there would be this acknowledgement without their narration. But when I was with groups of women, I would get very, very explicit stories about what men's bodies looked like when they emerged unconscious from these interrogation centers, what women did to take care of men in those first days and weeks after they'd emerged, what their bodies looked like, how they cared for them. Going for medical treatment was something that sometimes people did, but hospitals were not safe places. A lot of arrests actually happened in hospitals. So there was a lot of ways in which kind of social groups who don't have professionalized medical care were actually providing medical care. And those stories circulated from within the refugee camps of people who came to the wider community, and it became a big part of how people knew what those experiences were actually like.
Thank you so much, Professor Robinson, for joining us today. We're really appreciative, and it was a great conversation, very useful, insightful. We really hope that you return again to Milestones. You know, I know you have to go. I might ask Shamsher one last question before we end today's roundtable. I'd like to, because we're on this topic of political brutality, political violence.
I'd like to thank you. I do have to sign off, and I'd like to offer my deep respects to my colleague Shamsher. Thank you so much for allowing me to be in conversation with you, and thank you so much for the invitation.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you,
Okay.
Professor Robinson. So I would like to just quickly say that today's episode is dedicated to someone who recently in Bangladesh this last week was killed, martyred. His name is Abrar. There is in Buet, which is the engineering university in Bangladesh, and we would like to dedicate today's episode to him, and it's to his spirit. He was someone who supported the struggle in Kashmir, and he was Islamic and so on. And he was killed because of his religious orientation, because many assume his political orientation of support for Kashmir. In Bangladesh, the government and the security force already stated very clearly that anybody who raises voice for Kashmir would be in trouble. So the ruling party, the ruling student wing, the criminals of the ruling party basically killed our dear brother Abrar. So we would like to send our dua for his spirit, so that is raised in the highest heavens, and may Allah have mercy on him and his soul, and punish the criminals who took his life. So Shamsher, I'd like to, before I end, I would like to ask one more question, which is, I know you talked about sort of the historical legacy of domination, and historical legacy of genocide and of killing and political repression and so on. I'd like to know a little bit more about how the contemporary war on terror, which is also affecting the Sikh community in a very specific way. There seems to be a new configuration of the bodies of Sikhs in relation to bodies of Muslims. So I think in many ways our responses to the Indian state, to Hindutva in that area, the Indian Brahminical fascism, is that we have to understand our contemporary age of the war on terror, and this kind of similarization of the Sikh body and the Muslim body in many ways, and replacing one for the other when it's needed by the Indian state, which is resulting into us having conversations on this kind of new kind of political ethics like we talked about. If you could elaborate on that a little bit more, that would be very helpful for those of us who are very serious about the history of South Asia. And as we know that the war on terror is very specifically targeting South and Central Asia. So, and India is, as a state, and also getting a lot of support from Israel. But Indian state is basically within that region as the key player to help with the war on terror. And that's happening in India, in against Pakistan in some ways, in Pakistan, against populations like the Kashmiris. And we have other states that are kind of mimicking the Indian state, like the Bangladeshi regime now, which is a completely fascist state. So if you could elaborate on this kind of contemporary war on terror, the logic of that and how that is being used. I know you talked about the legacy of colonialism, but seems like to focus on the contemporary situation is also very, very important for us.
Yeah, I mean, India's has been completely like mimicking this dominant language that exists around Islamophobia, and creating this connection between Sikh religious extremists and Muslim extremists. And every we talk about Khalistan, there's this like this natural link that they're always trying to draw, that Khalistan is like is like Islamic Jihad, which is inherently violent and like motivated by their religion, and they make these very specific links to Lashkar-e-Taiba, Jaish-e-Mohammed, and Pakistani ISI. And it's the same narrative that exists within India, that today, like, the language has shifted to a national security issue, that there's a foreign plot to destabilize India, and the foreign plot one is kind of it would be hilarious if it wasn't like obviously deeply disturbing and tied to like state violence. But they're trying to dislocate Sikh resistance from Punjab, that it's not indigenous to this region. It's not actually originating from Punjab or from the connection Sikhs have to Punjab and Sikhi. It's actually coming from the foreign funding from the diaspora. But it's destabilizing a hard-won peace within India. And obviously you can see these like parallels are like the language that's being used, the ideas, the framework that's being imposed upon indigenous Sikh resistance. It's to raise any unique character of it and present it to whiteness, present it to the modernity as barbaric, other, the same as Islam, and play into those Islamophobic tropes that already exist. And that's where I think it's important that Sikhs are part of this conversation of Islamophobia. And to, when we don't really have a word to describe what we're being subjected to. There isn't like a Sikhophobia or phobia. There isn't a term that we have to describe what the Indian nation state is doing to us by using the logic of the war on terror, by using Islamophobia. So our expression is completely being stifled here. That's where Sikhs, I think, we have to learn, and we have to be part of these conversations and stop saying we're not Muslims, and we do suffer this we are mistaken for Muslims. After obviously 9/11, Balbir Singh, this owner, is shot, and the conversation was he was mistaken for a Muslim, and we're in solidarity with Muslims. We're not Muslims, and we're not talking about what's happening there either. And the Indian state is be able to use its position as a state. It's able to use the legitimacy it has on the world stage as a state to dislocate and erase any Sikh conversation, and any resistance to Indian Brahmanical hegemony is always forced into this box of, oh, they're like the Muslims that you fear so much, we're dealing with this problem, and they draw those direct connections all the time.
Thank you so much for your response. And the part of when you said that this is not an internal thing, the Indian state always portraying it as something global, that is precisely what the war on terror logic has been. I mean, even locally in Bangladesh, there's always worries about international travelers who are Muslim and more visibly Muslim and are practitioners of Islam, and so on. Thank you so much, Shamsher. I really appreciate your participation in this panel, along with Dr. Robinson. And thank you to our viewers. Peace and blessings, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum.